mechanism, the most common mechanism of injury is axial traction or a sudden pull of the extended pronated arm, resulting in dislocation of the radial head from the elbow joint. Parents usually bring the child to the plane of. Can you hear me, sir? Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Yeah.
Continue.
So the parents usually bring the child with the complaint of inability to move the affected arm, and on eliciting the history, usually there is a history of pulling the child along by the hand, though this history may be missing in as high as 30% of the cases. On examining the child, the limb is in a typical extended pronated position. Coming to the management part, management is quite simple. We need to bring back the dislocated radial head into the elbow joint. Various techniques and maneuvers have been explained, the most common being supination flexion technique, in which we gently supinate the forearm and flex the elbow while pressing on the radial head. So how do we see that our manual reduction is successful? We get a satisfying palpable click. The child is pain-free and starts using the involved limb immediately post-reduction. 2 attempts of reduction can be given, and more than 90% of the times, first attempt is successful. Here I want to highlight one important point, that parents must always be consulted regarding the recurrence of pulled elbow, as the reported incidence of recurrence in literature is as high as 40%. What if it is not reducing? Then we should always think of some other injury. So red flags are swelling around the elbow, history of fall, or if the history is uncertain, then we should always consider bony injury like this. To emphasize this further, this is a kid who presented to me around a couple of months back with a complaint of pain and swelling in the left elbow for 2 days. The kid was managed elsewhere as pulled elbow and reduction was attempted outside. However, there was no relief of pain and swelling. On clinically examining the child, I was pretty sure that it is not a pulled elbow, as can be seen that the left elbow is grossly swollen. So I further investigated the child and got the x-rays done. And as you can see that there is an undisplayed supracondylar fracture of the left elbow. The kid was managed with an above elbow cast and currently the kid is doing well. Talking about knee varus and valgus. We as clinicians come across quite frequently parents with the parents telling that my child has divergent legs, knees are touching, bowed legs, ankles are closed, or ankles are apart. So, are all these pathological? Before going through the pathology, I'll briefly rush through the physiology in this slide. So, at birth, the knees are in maximum varus, that is, the knees are wide apart, whereas the ankles are close together. And as the age increases, this knee varus gradually decreases, and at around 2 years of age, the knees are in neutral alignment. Post 2 years, the knees go into valgus, and at around 4 years of age, the knees are in maximum valgus, that is, the knees come closer and the ankles move apart. This maximum valgus then gradually decreases, and at around 8 years of age, a normal adult alignment is achieved. Now coming to pathological genu varum. Genu varum is said to be pathological if it is present for more than 2 years, if it is unilateral, if it is progressive or associated with pain or some underlying medical condition like rickets or renal failure. Similarly, genu valgum is pathological if it is unilateral, progressive, or associated with some medical condition like rickets or renal failure, or it is present even after 8 to 10 years, or the deformity is really severe, like more than 15 degrees. Coming to the treatment part, we have two options to realign the malaligned limb: guided growth correction or osteotomies. Talking about the guided growth correction first. In this, we stop the growth on one side of the knee, whereas we allow to continue the growth on the other side, so that gradually the deformity is corrected over a couple of years. For this, the prerequisite is that the child should have at least 2 years of skeletal growth remaining. Now, talking about osteotomies, in this we simply break the bone, realign it, and fix it with the plate and screws. Here, I want to bring in one very important point, that if the kid is referred timely, he can get away with a relatively minor procedure, that is guided growth correction. So, talking about the knock knees, this is one of the cases in which we did guided growth correction. The kid had bilateral knock knees. The kid was 10 years old, and I had put the plate on the medial or inner side of the knee and allowed the growth on the outer side. And as we can see, at around 18 months of age, 18 months of follow-up, the limb was grossly and beautifully aligned. Whereas this is another case of knock knees in which the skeletal growth was not much remaining. So I had to resort to a surgical option, that is the osteotomy, and we broke the bone, realigned it, and fixed it with a plate. So here I again want to emphasize that a kid can get away with a relatively minor procedure, that is guided growth correction, if the kid comes to us at a timely manner.
Dr. Gaurav, just sorry to interrupt. There is one thing in the chat box that the voice is not clear. It is cracking. I also feel that if the volume was louder, it was better. So if you could.
Uh, just a second. This is the maximum volume I have. Now am I audible?
A little better. A little better.
So I'll try to speak a bit
Your
more.
voice is clear. I think person who cannot hear वो अपना volume बढ़ाए वहीं से जिनको नहीं सुनाई नहीं दे रहा है.
Anyhow, sir, I'll try to speak.
या तो volume बड़ा अच्छा आ रहा है, बहुत अच्छा
ठीक है.
clear आ रहा है.
So the red flags for the limb malalignment are genu varum, if not resolved by 4 years, and genu valgum, if not resolved by 8 years, needs thorough pediatric orthopedic evaluation so that timely and less invasive procedures in the form of guided growth correction can be done. Now coming to flat foot, we all know that arch develops by around 8 years of age. The important question is that whether the flat foot is flexible or rigid, because the treatment is absolutely different in both the conditions. To see the flexibility of the flat foot, we have two very simple tests, heel rise and Jack's test. In heel rise, we simply tell the child to stand on the toes and we see whether the arch is regained or not. If it is regained, it indicates that the flat foot is flexible. Similarly, in Jack's test, we passively dorsiflex the great toe and see whether the arch is being formed. If it is again regained, it indicates that it is flexible. So flexible flat foot does not need any treatment unless and until it is painful. So what if the arch does not reconstitute? This indicates that the flat foot is not flexible. In other words, it indicates that it is rigid. This rigid flat foot is seen in tarsal coalition and congenital vertical talus. Both these conditions require formal pediatric orthopedic evaluation and treatment. Coming to another very common topic, congenital talipes equinovarus, commonly known as CTEV or clubfoot. This is the most common congenital anomaly of the foot and the incidence is 1 in 1,000 live births. In half of these, both the feet are involved. We all know that the foot is twisted internally in CTEV. Now, coming to the treatment part, the treatment is very simple, that we need to put serial casts which are to be changed every week till the deformity is fully corrected. This technique is known as Ponseti technique. I get a lot of questions on various forums that what is the ideal time or what is the earliest time to start the casting. So the answer to that question is 1 week. Once the deformity is fully corrected, the baby is fitted with the brace till 4 years of age. For the initial 3 months, the brace is put for 23 hours per day, and then the brace is gradually weaned off to nap time and night time. But it should continue till 4 years of age. Sometimes a small cut, that is tenotomy of the tendo-Achilles tendon, is done in order to correct the deformity fully, and then the child is given the brace. This is one of the cases treated by us. We can see that the child has left CTV or club foot. The foot is twisted internally. I started the casting at day 12 of age, and the kid was given 5 casts till the deformity was fully corrected. Currently, the kid is 6 months of age, and we can see that the deformity is nicely corrected. Though the kid is currently in flexion abduction brace, that is the CTV brace, and the brace will continue for 4 months, till 4 years of age. So the putting the brace is very important because the results of cast gets jeopardized if we do not put the brace till 4 years of age. Coming to another very common congenital anomaly of hip, that is developmental dysplasia of hip, commonly known as DDH. DDH encompasses a wide spectrum from mild temporary instability to frank dislocation. The earlier the diagnosis is made, the better the prognosis. So here comes the role of DDH screening. DDH screening can be done clinically as well as ultrasonographically. Talking about the clinical screening first, we should always look for asymmetric groin folds, limb length discrepancy, and limited abduction on flexion. American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that all babies should be examined at birth and at follow till first year, and if any of these signs are positive, then it should be referred to pediatric orthopedic surgeon. Now talking of ultrasonographic screening. First of all, I want to make it very clear that universal ultrasound screening is not recommended. American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that selective ultrasound screening should be done with patients having risk factors, that is breech and positive family history. So in other words, all kids born breech or with positive family history should be screened. Another very common question which I get is, what is the ideal time to do the ultrasound screening for it? It is 6 weeks. Now talking about the management. Management depends on the age at which it is diagnosed. If it is diagnosed early, say 6 to 12 weeks, the child is managed with the Pavlik harness. But in case the diagnosis is delayed, then we need to resort to surgical options like closed reduction, open reduction, and even sometimes pelvic osteotomies. So this is one of the cases. The kid was referred to me at 6 weeks of age with restriction of abduction and minimal shortening. The kid was a girl child and breech delivery. I got the ultrasound done, and as you can see that the femoral head is completely out of the acetabulum. This kid was managed with the Pavlik harness, and the Pavlik harness was put. Serial ultrasounds were done at weekly intervals for 6 weeks, and at 6 weeks we can see that the femoral head is nicely located in the acetabulum. On the contrary, this kid came to me at 5 years of age and presented with limp and shortening of the leg. X-rays showed right DDH. So in this case, I had to resort to surgical option, that is reconstruction of the right hip. I did femoral osteotomy as well as pelvic osteotomy in order to put the femoral head back into the acetabulum. So here again highlighting the point that early diagnosis and treatment is must, and ultrasound screening should always be done in breech delivery as well as in kids with positive family history. Coming to another common topic, brachial plexus birth injuries. The incidence of this pathology is 0.1 to 0.4%, with the risk factors being large birth weight, prolonged labor, difficult delivery, shoulder dystocia, forceps delivery, previous birth with brachial plexus palsy. As we all know, upper root injuries like Erb's palsy are more frequent compared to the lower and pan plexus injuries. Fortunately, the good thing is that the upper root injuries, which are more common, have the best prognosis, whereas the lower and pan plexus have the worst prognosis. Now, when a child is diagnosed with a brachial plexus injury, the kid should be thoroughly evaluated physically. At birth, the kid should be evaluated for Horner syndrome, color of the skin for any bruises, caput in the scalp, and muscles of different joints and movements of different joints and muscles. At 6 weeks, a detailed evaluation of muscle and nerve roots is done. And at 3 to 6 months, detailed assessment of the muscle recovery is done. Now, clavicular fracture, proximal humeral fractures, and septic shoulder may mimic brachial plexus injury. Now, pseudoparalysis because of the bony injuries usually resolve by 2 to 3 weeks, and septic shoulder, as you all know, will present in a typical infective manner. Now, aim of management in initial stages is to prevent the contractures of muscles and joint, and the long-term goal is to get the involved limb to the useful function. Significant recovery is seen in the first 3 months of the age, and then the pace slows down in the next 1 year. Sorry. If no recovery of the elbow flexion and shoulder abduction occurs by 3 to 6 months, then nerve reconstruction should be considered. Now, talking about secondary surgeries, simply speaking, these are procedures other than nerve reconstruction surgeries, and these include various soft tissue and bony surgeries in the involved limb. Those kids who do not recover fully or recover only partially within the first 3 months develop secondary deformities, and these are the kids who require secondary surgeries later. Now, coming to cerebral palsy, muscle movement as well as coordination is affected in this pathology, as we all know. Though the insult to brain is static and irreversible, but the deformities of upper and lower limb can be improved by orthopedic interventions. Management of this pathology is multidisciplinary, ranging from physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, medical management, and orthopedic management also plays a vital role in managing cerebral palsy patients. And we have various modalities like Botox injection, soft tissue procedures, and bony procedures. Talking about the Botox injection first, the mechanism of action of this is to stop the release of acetylcholine, resulting in reduced muscle activity and hence reduced spasticity. Botox is especially used in younger kids with deformities which are not fixed. So dosage of Botox which has to be injected depends not only on the body weight but also on the specific muscle in which it has to be injected. So we as pediatric orthopedic surgeons titrate the dose according to both these parameters and give the injection accordingly so that the best results can be achieved. Now, soft tissue and bony procedures are done in elderly children and in kids with fixed deformities. This was a kid who presented to us GMFCS2, age 10 years, and presented to us with right hip pain. We got the x-rays done, and as you can see that the femoral head is coming out of the acetabulum. We had to break the bone, bring it back into the acetabulum, and we fixed it with the plate. Now talking about transient synovitis of the hip. As the name suggests, this is a self-limiting inflammatory pathology of the hip joint, resulting in hip pain, limited range of motion, and limping. This is one of the most common cause of hip pain and limping in children, especially in the age group of 3 to 8 years. Often there is history of preceding viral infection, and I have seen at least 3 cases in last 1 month post-COVID infection also of this pathology. The most common differential diagnosis for this pathology is septic hip. We should always rule out septic arthritis of the hip in this condition. So, unlike septic arthritis of the hip, the fever is either not present or it is very low grade. Inflammatory markers like WBC, CRP, ESR are also usually within the normal range or slightly raised. Ultrasound will always show some effusion, and sometimes hip aspiration might be needed in order to confirm the diagnosis or rather to rule out septic hip. So the aim of management is to expedite the process of spontaneous resolution of the underlying inflammatory process with NSAIDs and bed rest. Clinical symptoms usually resolve within 2 to 3 weeks. Coming to another very common pathology which we come across as a pediatric orthopedic surgeons are bone and joint infection. Unlike soft tissue infections, bone and joint infections are really complex to manage. Osteomyelitis is the inflammation of the bone caused by the infecting organism. The acute hematogenous osteomyelitis is the most common type, with Staph aureus being the most common organism. However, in hemoglobinopathies like sickle cell anemia, Salmonella is the most common organism seen. Osteomyelitis has a bimodal incidence. It is seen in less than 2 years of age as well as 8 to 12 years of age. So here I want to give you one very important point that in less than 2 years of age, contagious joint involvement is quite common, whereas it is very rare in elderly group. The reason being the common blood supply of epiphysis and metaphysis in less than 2 years of age, which is no longer present in older kids. As in any other infective pathology, early diagnosis and treatment is the key to good prognosis. So we should always do a thorough physical examination, get the lab tests, WBCs, ESR, CRP. We always get the X-rays done, and most of the times MRI is done not only to diagnose the pathology but also see the extent of the bony involvement. Sometimes aspiration of the abscess is also done in order to confirm as well as to chalk out the antibiotic plan. Now, the management of bone and joint infection is based on the following treatment principle. First, an appropriate antibiotic is successful before pus formation. Second, and most importantly, antibiotics do not sterilize already formed abscess, and surgical removal is required in this case. Thirdly, if removal is adequate, antibiotics should prevent the reformation of abscess. Surgery should not damage the already ischemic bone. And lastly, but not the least important, antibiotics should be continued even after surgery. Here I want to bring in one very important point that if pus or abscess has been formed, then surgical removal should always be done along with the antibiotic therapy. So this is an example of an inappropriately managed septic arthritis of left hip. We can see the osteomyelitic changes in the left proximal hip. The femoral head is quite short, quite small, and the femoral head is coming out of the acetabulum as we can see on the X-ray. So these kind of complex pathologies require a complex surgical procedure, and we did femoral as well as pelvic osteotomy, and we brought the femoral head back into the acetabulum. As can be seen on the right hand side, the femoral head is now very well seated in the acetabulum. Children, as you all know, are quite prone to fall from height or fall while playing or RTA. Pediatric trauma presents one of the largest challenges to the healthcare system. Pediatric bones have high potential for healing, and these fractures usually heal rapidly and remodel. But how do we decide regarding the management? That is, how do we decide that whether we should go for a conservative approach or we should intervene surgically? We always consider following factors in order to make a decision. First of all, age of the kid. Secondly, injured bone. Third, type of the fracture. Fourth, fracture displacement pattern. And lastly, the neurovascular injury if associated. This is one of the example. The kid was 4-year-old with, as we can see on X-ray, with a fracture of the supracondylar region of humerus. So now, while chalking out the treatment plan, we'll always see again the same things which I discussed in the previous slide. First, age, that was 4 years, injured bone, distal humerus. The fracture was undisplaced and there was no neurovascular injury. So we did manage the kid conservatively in the form of above elbow cast. On the contrary, this is another patient with injury to the same bone, that is the distal humerus, but as we can see that the fracture is completely displaced. So again, while chalking out the treatment plan, we'll see age, that was 6 years, injured bone, though was the same, that is distal humerus, but the fracture was completely displaced and there was a neurovascular injury also. So we did we did surgery and we did closed reduction and K-wire fixation in this case. And we can see that the fracture is beautifully aligned. Coming to another example of pediatric trauma, we can see that there is a fracture of both bones of the forearm with grossly displaced fragment, and we did closed reduction and elastic nailing in this case. And we can see that the fractures are aligned now. Another example of pediatric trauma, this is a fracture shaft of femur, which was completely displaced, and we did closed reduction and elastic nailing in this case. Here I want to highlight one very important point, that in most of the cases, we usually do not need to give large incisions in order to reduce the fracture and fix it. As was done in this case, this was a 7-year-old kid. We simply gave a small incision on the lateral side of the knee and fixed the fracture aesthetically. Now, coming to nail bed injuries. Nail bed injuries are quite frequently seen in children, with crush injury by door being the most common mechanism. It is very important to know that surgical repair of nail bed is very crucial in order to avoid the long-term complication and avert permanent nail bed damage and deformity. This was a 7-year-old kid with a typical nail bed deformity and nail bed injury, and in the lower two slides we can see that the nail bed is repaired and fixed. Thank you. These are the common pathologies which I think we see in our day-to-day practice. I would be more than happy to answer the questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaurav. That was quite comprehensive. You covered most of the things which we see in our OPD practice. So there are a couple of questions which are there in the chat box. If anybody else has any questions, please put it in the chat box. So Dr. Rajiv Khandelwal was asking, if we are giving in CTEV, if we are giving braces for 4 years, how does the child walk during this period?
So sorry, can you repeat the question?
He's asking that if we are in CTEVs, if we are giving a brace for 4 years, so when does the child walk?
So, sir, that is what I explained earlier also. So we give the brace for 3 months, 23 hours per day, and then gradually wean it off, and then we give only nap time and night time, so that walking is not interfered.
Okay, so I hope this answers Dr. Rajiv Khandelwal's question. Then Dr. Ashadur was asking about brachial plexus injuries. She says, what is a stinger in a brachial plexus injury? And what is the timeline for treatment in brachial plexus injuries?
So, sir, brachial plexus injury diagnosis is majorly clinical. We need to rule out other pathologies like, as I told, bony injuries of the clavicle and humerus or septic shoulder. And once we confirm the diagnosis, and then we really evaluate the kid, and at around 6 months of age, we take a decision whether we need to intervene surgically or we should wait further, depending on the various markers. Like, two very important markers which we see are elbow flexion and shoulder abduction. If there is no elbow flexion or no shoulder abduction by 6 months, then it is the high time to consider surgical intervention.
And another question which was asked was, why does salmonella infections happen more often in hemoglobinopathies?
So, sir, this I'm not sure, but this is the incidence this is the correlation which I have seen and studied, that salmonella infection is quite common, and that too, it is diaphyseal. Most of the infections, osteomyelitis, are metaphyseal, but salmonella infection is always diaphyseal. This I know for sure, but I won't be able to answer that. I'll see to it.
And there's another question, how common is radial bone abnormalities or thumb abnormalities?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
How common is radial bone abnormalities or thumb abnormalities? So
sir,
this is a...
Yeah, so I think they are asking for the radial club hand. Radial club hand is quite uncommon, and whenever radial club hand is present, usually it is associated with thumb anomalies also.
And Dr. Ashok Chakravarti is asking, why are there two waves in septic arthritis, one at 2 years and this second one at 8 to 12 years? Any reason for this?
Sir, because first of all, less than 2 years, it has a common blood supply. So that is the reason for less than 2 years. And after around 8 to 12 years, I think the metaphyseal blood flow is quite a lot. So that could be the reason. And the capillary pattern is quite is like in order capillary pattern sir ऐसा होता है कि in that region the organism just sticks. I think that is the most likely reason for this.
And in this COVID season, there's another question: is there any orthopedic manifestations you have seen
Yes, sir.
post-COVID or during COVID?
Yeah. So as I discussed, sir, I've seen 3 transient synovitis of hip patients post-COVID.
Okay. And any other orthopedic problems because of COVID?
No, general myalgias and all. This is the specific pathology which I have seen.
And Dr. Sangeeta is asking, is there any role of bone density as an investigation in pediatrics?
Sir, it has some role in osteogenesis imperfecta, but rest of the pathologies, I don't think there is any. There is much role of this test.
In fact, I tell you that we had done this study of bone density, and I had given a thesis to one of my DNB student, and we wanted to see that by using steroids, so much of steroids in our renal patients, whether there are any changes and the bone density can help us. And we were seeing 2 types of steroids, normal prednisolone, and the other was deflazacort. And deflazacort, when it came, they said that it has less impact on the bone. So we compared bone densities, and to our utter surprise, these values were not very helpful. So I just want to ask Gaurav that and then we gave it up, that there were no results. We were finding any differences or any particular pattern. And even our radiologist said that we don't have normative data. We can't tell you whether these are within normal limits or these are low. So what's your experience, Gaurav, about that?
So we quite infrequently use bone mineral density test in pediatric age group. We use when I was doing general orthopedics, we quite frequently use that test to see osteoporosis. So that is what I said, that the main role of BMD is in osteoporosis, and I don't think pediatrics there is much help we can get from this test.
Because उसमें कोई normative data ही नहीं हमें मिल रहा था कि how much is the normal, so they were not able to give us that whether one drug is causing less osteoporosis than the other drug. पहले तो normal देखो, normal ही नहीं है, तो how to compare that?
So because sir, इसमें use pediatric age group में there are no standardized data, because very less people use this test in pediatric age group.
So your experience is also not very
Yes,
positive with the bone density.
yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
It does not help in decision making, I would say,
Right.
in most of the pathologies.
Dr. Gaurav, I would like to ask one question. How do we pick up scoliosis early, and what would be the long-term consequences of not picking it up?
Ma'am, sorry, can you repeat the question?
I'm asking about scoliosis.
Yes, ma'am.
How do we pick it up early, and what would be the consequences of not picking it up?
Ma'am, actually, scoliosis has a wide spectrum. So, first of all, we need to identify whether it is a congenital scoliosis or adolescent scoliosis, idiopathic scoliosis. So, if it is congenital scoliosis, it will be obvious within a few years. But if it is adolescent scoliosis, it will come only in adolescence. So, ideally, the spine should always be screened. The general orthopedic practice is that we just run our fingers from the neck to the gluteal region, and we can identify whether there is some pathology in the spine, and then we take the decision accordingly.
And what if we miss it? Can there be some long-term consequences?
Sorry, ma'am.
Can there be any long-term consequences if we miss it?
Ma'am, long-term consequences, as in if it is a congenital thing, then the thoracic cavity also becomes shrunken, and so that can result in lung complications and other things. So ideally, it should be diagnosed as soon as possible. Screening should always be done, ma'am, in doubt.
Gaurav, when you're using Botox for cerebral palsy, so what is the cost of Botox and how frequently you need to do it?
Sir, cost depend on the dosage. It comes in 2 vials, 50 and 100 units. Usual cost of Botox, including the surgical procedure and all, is somewhere around 50,000. And rest, what was the second question, sir? Sorry.
How frequently you would need to do it?
Sir, I would say we quite frequently use it in lesser age group when the deformities are not fixed. We quite frequently use it, especially in less than 4 to 5 years of age.
And but it needs to be done only once, or you have to repeat it again?
Sir, ideally it should not be repeated, but we can repeat a few times.
Okay. And another question is regarding flat foot. How frequently are we using special footwear now for rigid flat foot?
So, sir,
Because it used to be used quite often earlier.
So, sir, in my practice and the current literature supports that there is no role of orthosis in flat foot unless and until it is painful or there is problem with shoe wear while wearing.
And Dr. Manju Sharma is asking, in nail bed injury, does the nail grow back properly always?
So, sir, that depends. If that is what I said, that nail bed injury should always be repaired if needed, because the lacerations need to be approximated. If we do not approximate the laceration, then nail bed deformities can happen.
If anyone has any other question, please unmute yourself and you can ask the question. Dr. Ashok Chakravarti, any comments, any questions?
I'm happy that Gaurav gave a very lucid presentation about one of the commonest problems which we come across in OPD level. And the thing is, he picked up all the very important things which are routinely seen by us. And he has very judiciously done justice to everything.